The lobby of the Larkspur Grand Hotel sparkled in the morning light. Charlotte Van Buren stood near the window, her cream-colored suit perfectly pressed, smiling as she conversed with two investors from Europe. She nodded at the right moments, laughed at the right times, standing confidently as if the place belonged to her. From the entrance, a black girl about 10 years old walked in, an old backpack on her shoulder, holding a white envelope in her hand. The girl stopped at the front desk. "May I sit and wait for my dad for a bit?" The receptionist looked up, her eyes quickly scanning the girl before pausing. Charlotte heard it and turned her head. She walked over, her gaze lingering on the child, as if it were an out-of-place detail that had just intruded into a perfect scene. "Do you know this is a hotel for guests with reservations?" Charlotte's voice was cold and firm. The girl hesitated slightly. "I just need to sit on that chair over there. I won't bother anyone." Charlotte no longer looked at the girl and turned to the receptionist. "Who is her father?" There was no immediate answer. The girl lowered her head, her hands clutching the envelope tightly. Charlotte's lips curled slightly. "I'm guessing it's no one here." She turned to the security guard. "Escort her out before I have to call security management." The older security guard hesitated. "Ma'am, the kid is just—" "I said out now," Charlotte interrupted, her voice full of irritation. One of the two investors stopped talking. A phone was pulled out. The screen started recording. The girl was asked to leave the lobby, walking slowly but with her back straight, head not bowed, the white envelope still hugged tightly to her chest. As the glass doors closed, Charlotte turned back to her partners, lightly brushing her sleeve, as if she had just touched something unclean. "Sorry for the interruption," she said, her smile returning to its proper place. She had no idea that in those brief few minutes, she had just driven out of the hotel lobby, the only person who could save her dying company. That morning in the Larkspur Grand Hotel lobby began with a cold white light, reflecting off the polished marble floor. Charlotte Van Buren stood in that luxurious space with the posture of a CEO accustomed to power. Back straight, steps firm, her cream-colored suit perfectly tailored. She smiled as she shook hands with two old partners, delivering smooth small talk, as if this were just an ordinary meeting. None of them knew that behind that calm facade was a company bleeding out, day by day. Van Buren Tech had only 11 to 12 weeks of cash left, and 23 investment funds had said no, most with polite but firm emails. Ethan Price, her CFO, stood nearby, with a tablet clutched tightly to his chest, his eyes heavy. When the partners temporarily stepped away, Ethan approached, lowering his voice until it almost blended into the lobby noise. "Runway's 11 weeks. If this deal slips, we're done." Charlotte didn't turn to look at him, her smile still in place, only her eyes turning slightly colder. "Don't talk about that here," she replied, her voice low but decisive. This was not the place to reveal desperation. On the list of potential investors, only one name remained, a name that didn't appear on any public rankings, but had the power to decide the fate of the entire company. Sienna approached, trying to keep her voice steady. "The investor has confirmed. 9 o'clock. They said they'll be on time." Charlotte nodded slightly, raising her coffee cup to her lips, as a familiar reflex to hide her tightly clenched hand. In the glamorous hotel lobby, where everything operated according to the standards of power and money, no one noticed that the female CEO was standing right on the edge of the abyss, placing all her hopes on a meeting that hadn't even begun yet. That same morning, just a few blocks from the hotel lobby, a black car glided slowly through the rush-hour traffic, heading toward the same destination. Nia Carter sat next to her father, hugging her worn backpack tightly along with a carefully folded white envelope, carrying a seriousness uncommon for a 10-year-old child. Malcolm Carter sat beside his daughter, silent as usual, his simple dark suit giving no indication that he was the person the upcoming meeting was waiting for. The sole remaining anonymous investor, the one into whose hands the fate of Van Buren Tech had unwittingly been placed. For Malcolm, this wasn't just a business meeting. Before any major deal, he always followed a principle that very few people knew. He wanted to see how people treated others when there was no identity, no power, no numbers attached. And today, Nia was the most important part of that test. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Malcolm asked, his eyes still looking straight ahead. Nia nodded, her voice small but clear. "At school, I'm doing a presentation on fairness and how adults treat strangers. I want to see if what you say is true." Malcolm gave a rare smile. He had told his daughter many times that dignity doesn't come from money or titles, but from how others see you even when you're nobody in their eyes. "If they respect you when you're not someone's kid, then they're worthy of my money," he said, his voice calm, as if stating the obvious. Nia tilted her head in thought for a moment, then asked, "What if they don't respect me?" Malcolm answered without hesitation, "Then I'll know what I'm investing in." When the car stopped in front of the hotel, Malcolm prepared to get out immediately to make the confirmed appointment. Nia suddenly remembered the envelope in her backpack, quickly pulled it out, but her father had already opened the door and was walking quickly toward the lobby. "Dad," the girl called after him, but Malcolm only turned back to wave, signaling he'd see her later. Nia watched her father's figure disappear behind the glass doors, feeling a bit disappointed, then reassured herself. She took a deep breath, did exactly as her father had instructed, and walked into the lobby like an ordinary child, with no business card, no name, no one accompanying her. Inside, the cool and quiet atmosphere was completely different from outside. Jerome, the older black security guard standing near the door, glanced at Nia and gave a slight nod of greeting, his eyes kind. Nia smiled back, feeling a little lighter. She only intended to find a chair to sit and wait, the white envelope still securely in her hand, carrying a good luck message written in still clumsy handwriting. Nia didn't know that the moment she stepped into the hotel lobby, the test her father had set had already begun, and its outcome would not only decide an investment, but also expose the true nature of people who seemed so civilized in this luxurious space. Nia Carter entered the hotel lobby with a slow walk, her shoulders slightly drawn in from the habit of a child, taught to be careful when entering adult spaces. No one noticed her in the first few seconds, and Nia wasn't seeking attention either. She stopped at the front desk, placed both hands on the edge of the cold stone, stood up straight as she had practiced many times at home, then spoke in a small but clear voice. "May I sit and wait for my dad for a bit?" The question echoed in the wide lobby, but caused no disturbance, interrupting none of the ongoing conversations. The receptionist looked up, momentarily surprised, her eyes quickly scanning from Nia's young face down to the old backpack, then pausing too long on the worn heels of her shoes. She smiled out of professional reflex, but the smile lacked warmth. "Does your dad have a reservation?" Nia shook her head. "I just need to sit on that chair over there," the girl said, pointing to the row of seats by the glass windows. "I won't bother anyone." The receptionist didn't answer immediately. She glanced at the computer screen, then looked around the lobby as if seeking confirmation, finally leaning in to call the manager in a voice low enough but unable to hide her unease. At the same time, Charlotte Van Buren was standing a few meters from the desk, continuing her conversation with the two old partners, but the receptionist's unusual hesitation had caught her attention. Charlotte turned, walking toward the desk with the confident stride of someone accustomed to people automatically making way for her. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying unquestionable authority. The receptionist quickly explained, her eyes showing slight relief at having someone else make the decision. "Ma'am, she says she wants to sit and wait for her dad in the lobby." Charlotte looked at Nia, a quick, sharp glance that didn't hide her judgment. She didn't bend down to the child's level, nor did she ask any polite follow-up. "Do you know this is a hotel for guests with reservations?" Charlotte said, her voice even as if reminding someone of an obvious rule. Nia paused slightly but kept her polite tone. "I just need to sit on that chair over there. I won't bother anyone." Charlotte turned to the receptionist. "Who is her father? Name?" The question wasn't asked to find an answer but as a final step to confirm a judgment already formed. Nia lowered her head, her hands clutching the white envelope tightly. "I'm just waiting for my dad," the girl replied, avoiding eye contact with Charlotte. A faint smile appeared on Charlotte's lips. Not an openly mocking one, but the familiar expression of someone who believed they had just confirmed their initial hunch. "Of course," she said, then turned to Jerome, the older security guard standing near the door. Escort her out. Don't make my guests uncomfortable. Jerome stood still for a second, his eyes lingering on Nia's face before shifting to Charlotte. Ma'am, the kid is just... I'm not debating. Charlotte cut in, her voice hardening. It's the policy. Around them, a few guests began to notice. A man near the elevator pulled out his phone, pretending to read messages, but with the lens pointed toward the front desk. A middle-aged couple exchanged a quick glance, then looked away, no one saying anything. Jerome took a deep breath, bent down to Nia's level. Come outside with me, okay? He said softly. Nia nodded. She didn't ask more, didn't protest, just quietly turned, her arms hugging the envelope tightly to her chest, like a defensive reflex. As she passed the glass doors, her eyes paused briefly, long enough to see the adults continuing their conversations, as if she had never been there. Outside, the air was cooler. Jerome stopped on the steps, looking at Nia. You okay? He asked. Nia nodded again, but this time her lips pressed together tightly, her eyes reddening, though tears hadn't fallen yet. I'm just waiting for my dad, she said, as if repeating an obvious truth that no one inside the lobby wanted to hear. Jerome stood still for a few more seconds, then returned to his post. Inside, Charlotte had turned her back to the door, her professional smile returning, as she resumed the conversation with her partners, her voice smooth as if never interrupted. No one in the group mentioned the incident again. No one asked questions. In that luxurious hotel lobby, everything quickly returned to its familiar order. Charlotte Van Buren didn't know, and didn't even consider the possibility, that her decision just now wasn't merely managing the space, but a moral choice made in a few short minutes. She didn't know that the child just escorted out wasn't a misplaced guest, or a minor nuisance to be handled quickly, but the daughter of the only man who could save Van Buren Tech from the brink of bankruptcy. And while Charlotte continued standing firmly in the hotel lobby, believing she was still in control, the real test she was completely unaware of had ended, leaving an irreversible result. Malcolm Carter arrived in front of the hotel a few minutes later than planned. As soon as the car stopped, he saw Nia sitting on the stone steps near the entrance, legs together, her backpack placed neatly beside her, and the white envelope still hugged tightly in her hands, just as when he had left her. Without anyone saying a word, Malcolm already understood what had happened. He didn't rush out of the car, just sat still for a moment, observing his daughter from afar, observing how she tried to keep her back straight, even though her shoulders had slightly slumped, observing the small face turned toward the glass doors, as if still waiting for something to change. Malcolm walked over, not calling her name right away, just standing in front of Nia long enough for her to look up. Dad, Nia said, her voice normal, without blame or resentment. Malcolm sat down at her level, placing both hands on his knees, his eyes quickly scanning her face for every detail, a reflex, long formed. Did anyone touch you? He asked, his voice low and even. Nia shook her head. No. Malcolm nodded lightly, waiting another second. Do you want to go home? Nia thought for a moment, then shook her head again. I'm just waiting for you. Malcolm didn't ask more, just sat beside her, letting the silence fill in what had just happened. After a while, Nia told the story herself, her voice steady as if recounting something already finished. She talked about the front desk, about the woman behind it calling someone, about another woman who approached with very confident steps, about the questions asked as if Nia had done something wrong just by standing there. She said, I didn't belong here, Nia said, not crying, not shaking, just emphasizing each word lightly, as if trying to understand their meaning. Malcolm didn't react immediately. He listened to the end, without interrupting, without showing the anger many would expect from a father in that situation. How did you feel when she said that? He asked. Nia was silent for a few seconds. I'm not sad about being asked to leave, the girl said slowly. I'm sad because she didn't see me as a person. That statement made Malcolm exhale lightly, A very soft breath, but enough for him to remind himself to stay composed. He placed his hand on Nia's shoulder, not squeezing tightly, just letting her know he was there. "So today you just proved something," Malcolm said, his voice still gentle, like when he taught her lessons. "Proved what, Dad?" Nia asked. Malcolm looked toward the hotel's glass doors, where everything inside continued as normal, then turned back to his daughter. "Proved that there are places that talk a lot about standards, but forget the most basic thing," he replied. Nia looked down at the envelope in her hand. "I was going to give this to you before you went in," the girl said, holding up the envelope. Malcolm took it, not opening it right away. "I'm very glad you brought it," he said. "But what you did today is more important than any letter." Malcolm stood up, taking his daughter's hand. "Do you want to go inside with me now?" Nia looked at the glass doors, then shook her head. "I think there's no need anymore." Malcolm nodded, not trying to persuade her. He led her back to the car, without looking back at the hotel again. In that moment, Malcolm had made his decision without needing to call anyone, without needing to meet with assistants, without needing to reconsider any numbers or terms. He wasn't angry, didn't feel the need to walk in and demand justice for his daughter with power or money. He had seen enough. The test he had set had its result, clearer and colder than any due diligence report. And while inside the hotel, Charlotte Van Buren continued her meeting, believing everything was going according to plan. Malcolm Carter had left with his daughter, carrying a decision that would soon shake the entire world she was trying to hold together. Malcolm Carter sat in the car as the door closed, the engine humming softly, but he signaled the driver not to leave yet. Nia sat beside him, her back against the seat, hands on her lap, silently looking out the window, while Malcolm took out his phone without hesitation or doubt, typing a short message to his personal assistant canceling this morning's meeting. No rescheduling, no further explanation. Just that was enough. The message sent. He put the phone down as if completing a minor task on a long to-do list. But Nia knew it wasn't minor. She was familiar with how her father thought, familiar with the silence that always preceded big decisions. Malcolm's assistant called back almost immediately, voice still professional but unable to hide surprise, asking if there had been a mistake, because this was a deal long in preparation, through many rounds of due diligence, reaching the final step. Malcolm listened to the end without interrupting, his eyes still looking forward at the Larkspur Grand Hotel standing there, gleaming, discreet, confident in its place in the city. "No mistake," Malcolm said, his voice even, neither loud nor soft. The assistant paused for a beat, then asked again, slower and more cautiously, whether he was sure because of the money, the influence, the consequences. Malcolm answered immediately, without needing to think further, that precisely because it was a big deal he couldn't ignore the small things, that he had seen enough of their culture right from the hotel lobby, and no report could say it clearer than that. The assistant exhaled very lightly on the other end, like someone who had worked long enough to know when not to push further. Only asking if he needed an official notice sent. Malcolm said no, just leave it as is, no explanation, no apology, no door left open. The call ended. Malcolm put the phone away, turned to look at Nia, seeing his daughter looking at him thoughtfully, not curious, not alarmed, just sorting what she had witnessed into some corner of her mind. "Aren't you angry at them, Dad?" Nia asked, her voice small but clear. Malcolm shook his head. "Anger doesn't change anything," he said. "Knowing and choosing does." Meanwhile, inside the hotel, Charlotte Van Buren stood in her familiar spot near the window, still maintaining the proper smile with those facing her, her eyes occasionally glancing toward the door, as if waiting for some signal confirming the major investor's arrival. Sienna approached, lowering her voice to report that the other side had just messaged. The investor would not be coming. Charlotte froze very briefly, just a fraction of a second, then nodded, her smile still in place, only slightly stiffer. "They canceled?" Charlotte asked, as if it were a minor technical detail not worth dwelling on. Sienna said yes, no reason given, no offer to reschedule. Ethan, standing nearby, overheard, and his face paled slightly, But Charlotte was quick to say that this wasn't unusual, that some people like to use absence to assert power, that it was just another psychological game. Ethan didn't argue, but his eyes were uneasy, because he knew the list was exhausted, knew this name wasn't like the previous ones. Charlotte turned away from the conversation, continuing to talk with her partners as if nothing had happened, but in her mind she had already begun rearranging backup plans, though she didn't want to admit it. She didn't know that the decision had been made, not because of numbers, not because of terms, but because of a brief moment she hadn't even cared about. Outside, Malcolm's car finally pulled away, leaving the hotel and merging into the morning city traffic. Malcolm glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, not out of regret but to close a chapter that had ended before it could begin. He didn't feel he had just given up an opportunity, but had avoided a mistake. Nia leaned her head against the seat, eyes closed, the envelope now in her father's hands, unopened, but she didn't ask anymore, because she understood that today's test wasn't just for others, but also a lesson for herself. And while Charlotte Van Buren believed she had just faced a familiar power play from the investment world, Malcolm Carter had left with the calm of someone who knew very well the value of the money he held, and more importantly, the value of the people he would never allow to be disregarded. At 10:30 a.m., Charlotte Van Buren had returned to her private office on the top floor, the glass door closing behind her like a habit to separate her from all the noise outside. But this time the quiet didn't bring the familiar sense of control, because in her mind still lingered the brief moment when Sienna reported that the investor had canceled the meeting without leaving any message. Charlotte sat down in her chair, opened her laptop, trying to focus on the spreadsheet in front of her, as if the familiar numbers could help her regain her breath, but the lines blurred quickly, refusing to stay still. She was just about to call Ethan in, when there was a knock on the door, light but urgent, different from Sienna's usual rhythm. "Come in," Charlotte said, without looking up. The door opened. Sienna stepped in, but she didn't stand in her usual spot near the desk. She froze near the door, both hands clutching the tablet to her chest, as if holding something too heavy for her. Charlotte noticed the difference, and looked up. "What is it?" she asked, her voice slightly sharp from impatience. Sienna swallowed hard, then spoke very slowly, each word carefully weighed. "Do you know who the little girl this morning was?" Charlotte frowned, leaning fully back in her chair, her eyes clearly showing irritation. "A kid who wanted to enter the lobby," she replied immediately, as if that story had ended long ago, and wasn't worth bringing up again. "If you're going to talk about that, we have more important things to do." Sienna didn't argue, just took one more step, and placed the tablet on the desk in front of Charlotte. "You should see this," she said, her voice lowering. Charlotte glanced at the screen reluctantly, but in just a few seconds, the indifference on her face vanished completely. On the screen was an article with a prominent headline, below it a photo of a black man standing on the stage at a charity event, next to him a little girl in a light blue dress, her hair neatly braided, a shy but very familiar smile. Charlotte felt her throat go dry. She touched the screen, zoomed in on the photo, closely examining the girl's face. There was no doubt anymore. It was the child who had stood in the hotel lobby that morning. "No way," Charlotte said, the words coming out almost reflexively, but even she could hear the weakness in that denial. Sienna stood still, not interrupting, just letting the truth spread through the room on its own. Charlotte quickly read the lines below the photo, the name Malcolm Carter appearing clearly, along with a list of major investment deals, the funds he backed, numbers that just glancing at were enough to make her hands go cold. "This is," Charlotte stopped mid-sentence, unable to finish. "This is Malcolm Carter," Sienna continued, her voice trembling slightly. "And the little girl with him in the photo is his daughter." Charlotte looked up sharply, her eyes jerked away from the screen. "Daughter?" she repeated, even though the answer was already obvious. Sienna nodded. "Nia Carter." Charlotte felt like something had dropped straight into her stomach, heavy and cold. She leaned back in her chair, both hands limp on the armrests, her mind blank for a few rare seconds where she couldn't think of any reaction. The meeting confirmation email, Sienna went on, as if knowing Charlotte needed more proof to believe it, was from Carter Meridian's office. I double-checked. No mistake. Charlotte closed her eyes quickly, then opened them, as if wanting to confirm she was still awake. She remembered the morning, remembered the girl's eyes looking up when questioned, remembered how she had ordered the guard to escort the child out without hesitation. All those images now overlapped, no longer scattered but connected into a chain that was clear and cruel. Charlotte stammered, then stopped, not knowing what to ask next. Sienna took a deep breath. He canceled the meeting, she said, and his office isn't responding to any further requests. Charlotte raised her hand to her forehead, fingers pressing hard, as if a headache had just hit. This can't be happening, she said, but her voice had lost all certainty. It's just a misunderstanding. Sienna didn't respond, because both knew this wasn't a misunderstanding in the way Charlotte was used to using the word. Ma'am, Sienna hesitated, then continued. I think he was there, this morning, outside the lobby. Charlotte opened her eyes, staring straight at Sienna. What did you say? I think he arrived, Sienna said, but didn't come inside. The room fell silent. Charlotte looked back at the photo on the tablet, at Malcolm Carter's face next to his daughter's, calm, composed, completely different from the chaos swirling in her head. She suddenly realized that the most important decision in this deal had been made before she even sat down at the negotiating table, and that she hadn't been present for that moment. A chill ran down her spine, not from fear of losing money, but from the belated realization that she had revealed something she always thought she controlled very well. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, eyes still fixed on the screen, and for the first time in years, she didn't know what to do next. Charlotte Van Buren sat motionless for a few more minutes after Sienna left the room, the tablet still lying on the desk like undeniable evidence. Then she reached for her phone, quickly scrolling through her contacts, finding the name that had just appeared in her mind with an unprecedented weight. Malcolm Carter, her finger pausing for a very short beat before dialing. As if in that moment she still hoped she was misunderstanding something. The call rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail, a neutral recorded voice coming on, polite and distant, leaving no room for urgency. Charlotte hung up, took a deep breath, then called again, with the same result. She put the phone down, clasped both hands in front of her, then picked it up again, this time opening email, quickly typing a cautious subject line, not mentioning the morning, not mentioning the child, just talking about a regrettable misunderstanding and a desire to reconnect. She read the email 3 times, editing each word to make the tone soft enough yet professional enough, then hit send, her heart beating a little harder, when the confirmation sound played. 5 minutes passed, no response. 10 minutes, still silence. Charlotte sent another email, longer, more careful, this time with a clearer apology, but still evasive, avoiding naming what she wasn't ready to face directly. Her inbox remained empty. She stood up, paced a few steps around the room as if movement could help clear her thoughts. But each lap only made the feeling of losing control grow. The office door burst open without a knock. Ethan Price stepped in, his face tense to the point where he could no longer maintain the usual calm of a longtime finance professional. "Have you called him yet?" Ethan asked right away. "No beating around the bush," Charlotte nodded. "I called and emailed. And no response." Ethan let out a dry laugh, a sound with no humor at all. He walked to the desk, slammed down a folder, the numbers he knew by heart now dancing before Charlotte's eyes. "Do you understand what we just lost?" Ethan asked, his voice higher than usual, no longer hiding his anger. Charlotte looked at him, mouth opening, then closing, unable to find an answer. "This isn't a regular fund," Ethan continued. "Not the kind of investor who plays power games or pushes terms at the last minute. Malcolm Carter invests based on character, not on presentations, not on flashy promises." He paused for a beat, looking straight at Charlotte. "He looks at how a person treats those who have nothing to offer them." Charlotte felt her throat tighten. I didn't know, she said, her voice faltering, almost a whisper. Ethan closed his eyes for a second, as if trying to hold something back. Not knowing isn't an excuse anymore, he said, this time his voice lower, more tired than angry. We have 11 weeks left. Without him, we have no plan B. Charlotte returned to the desk, sat down, feeling as if the entire weight of the room was pressing on her shoulders. She reopened the sent emails, reading each sentence with different eyes, realizing the coldness hidden behind the words she thought were polite. Realizing she was trying to beg for another meeting, using the same language that had kept her from seeing the person standing in front of her that morning. I'll call again, Charlotte said, more to herself than to Ethan. She dialed a third time, then a fourth, each time voicemail. She sent another email, this time stripping away the layers of wording, writing directly that she was sorry for her actions, that she wanted to explain, to meet in person. The email went out, then disappeared into the familiar silence. Ethan leaned against the desk, hands braced on it, looking at Charlotte with eyes mixing disappointment and helplessness. He won't respond, Ethan said. When Malcolm Carter goes silent, it means he's made his decision. Charlotte looked up, her eyes red but without tears. Can't we do anything? She asked. Ethan shook his head slowly. Maybe, he said, but not the way you're doing it. Charlotte looked down at her hands, realizing they were trembling slightly. For the first time since founding Van Buren Tech, she couldn't see the path ahead, not because of missing data or strategy, but because she had revealed something no financial model could cover. And while her inbox remained empty, Charlotte began to understand that the silence from Malcolm Carter wasn't a negotiation tactic, but a complete, cold, and decisive answer, more final than any rejection she had ever received. Everything began slipping out of Charlotte Van Buren's control just a few hours later, in a way she didn't realize until it had already spread widely. The first video appeared on social media around noon, posted by a guest who had been in the lobby that morning. A short clip, filmed from afar. The image not perfectly clear, but enough to show a black girl standing near the entrance, an elegantly dressed woman saying something to the guard, then the child being asked to leave. The caption was very short, no embellishment, just stating that a CEO had kicked a black girl out of the hotel because she thought the child didn't belong there. Within less than an hour, the video was shared hundreds of times, comments starting to appear, at first cautious, then increasingly harsh, each person attaching their own familiar meaning to the story. By early afternoon, a tech blog posted the first article, sourcing from an eyewitness at the scene, not naming anyone, but describing the context in detail, emphasizing that the incident happened right before a major investment meeting, and questioning the leadership culture of the company involved. The article wasn't long, but the headline made it spread quickly, followed by numerous other sites quoting it, each quote adding a detail, an opinion, a new layer of judgment. Charlotte learned about it, not from the press but from her phone starting to vibrate non-stop, notifications pouring in from channels she usually used only for industry news. Sienna returned to the room, this time without knocking, her face pale. The video is spreading fast, she said, and they're starting to name the company. Charlotte picked up her phone, watched the clip, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Everything in the video was cut short. No context, no explanation, just the images and the conclusions viewers drew themselves. We need to respond, Charlotte said, her voice more urgent than usual. Contact PR immediately. But before any statement could be drafted, the desk phone rang, an internal board number on the screen. Charlotte picked up. The board chairman's voice came on immediately. No greeting, no preamble. Are you seeing what's happening out there? He asked. Charlotte swallowed hard. I'm handling it, she replied, though she herself wasn't sure what she was handling. You just turned a funding round into an ethics crisis, the voice on the other end said, cold enough that raising the volume wasn't necessary to make it heavy. We're getting calls from partners, from advisors, even from people not directly involved but influential. No one's asking about our technology anymore. Charlotte was silent. They're asking about you, the chairman continued. About how you treated a child. The call ended quickly, giving Charlotte no chance to explain. She put the phone down, feeling as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Less than 15 minutes later, another board member called, voice not harsh but distant, asking about damage control plans, about the official message, about whether she was prepared to take responsibility. Charlotte answered mechanically, each sentence drawn from crisis training sessions she had attended, but this time none of the words felt truly right. Meanwhile, new articles kept appearing, some questioning the work environment at Van Buren Tech, some bringing up old rumors once ignored, weaving them into a larger story. Charlotte's name began appearing in headlines she never thought she'd read. The PR team sent up a draft statement, neutral, cautious, emphasizing that the company was reviewing the incident and committed to respecting all individuals. But when Charlotte read it, she knew it wouldn't be enough. She had lost control of her own image, not because of a smear campaign, but because a very real moment had been captured and spread faster than any official response. Ethan returned to the room, placing his phone on the desk, the screen showing a flood of messages from current investors. They're asking if this reflects the company culture, he said, voice low, and I don't know how to answer. Charlotte looked out the window, the city still operating as usual, cars moving, people walking, but her world wasn't. With each passing hour, the story was told in ways she could no longer edit, each share adding a new layer of meaning to her actions that morning. Charlotte realized this crisis was unlike any before, because it didn't revolve around the product, didn't revolve around numbers, but around a much simpler and far harder question: who she was when power wasn't shielding her. And as the phone kept vibrating, Charlotte understood that the most frightening thing wasn't the media, wasn't the board, but that she had lost the ability to control the narrative about herself in a way no strategy could immediately reverse. As the office gradually emptied and the city lights outside shifted to the deep yellow of late evening, Charlotte Van Buren remained alone behind her desk, the glass door closed tight. Her phone silenced, but the computer screen in front of her constantly lit, opening tab after tab as if she were trying to fill a void that had just opened in her mind with as much information as possible. At first, Charlotte only intended to read to better understand Malcolm Carter as an investor, as she always did with any major partner. The deals he had joined, the industries he favored, the times he invested and the times he pulled out. But very quickly, the financial analyses gave way to other articles, fewer numbers, more words, and harder to read in a way Charlotte wasn't used to. She read about Malcolm's investment philosophy, about how he rejected companies with attractive profit models, but internal cultures described as authoritarian or exclusionary, about how he often said money is just a tool to amplify values already present in people, not something that creates those values. Charlotte lingered longer on an old interview, where Malcolm talked about his early career year, entering meeting rooms as a young black man whom no one recognized as the decision-maker, where handshakes were often given to someone else, and questions always came with the assumption he was just an assistant or accompanying someone. Charlotte read on, slower, feeling a vague discomfort spreading in her chest, not because she disagreed with what Malcolm said, but because she recognized those situations weren't unfamiliar. She had witnessed them, participated in them, and dismissed them as mistakes not worth dwelling on. Another talk by Malcolm appeared, recorded at a university, where he spoke of dignity as something non-negotiable, not something to put after standards, processes, or brand image. Charlotte read each line, noticing how carefully he chose words, not directly condemning, not calling for outrage, just repeating that how an organization treats the most vulnerable reveals its true nature most clearly. She leaned back in her chair, eyes still on the screen, those words no longer on the page, but gradually overlaying her morning memory, where she had stood in the hotel lobby, making a decision in a few short seconds, completely convinced she was doing the reasonable thing. Charlotte opened more articles, this time stories Malcolm shared about his daughter, about trying to teach her that her worth didn't depend on how others saw her, about letting her experience the world as authentically as possible, even if it sometimes meant she would get hurt. Charlotte closed her eyes, breathed deeply, for the first time that day allowing herself to truly pause. She remembered Nia's face at the front desk, remembered how the girl kept her back straight, remembered the composure unfit for a child her age, and a chill came over her as Charlotte realized she hadn't seen that in the morning. She opened a new file on her computer. No title, just starting to type as if talking to herself, words unpolished, unprofessional. She wrote that she had thought it was just a kid wanting into the lobby, that she believed she was acting according to policy, that she had never considered discrimination. But the more she wrote, the emptier those sentences felt. She paused, deleted a few lines, then typed slower, more carefully, as if dissecting each thought. She wrote that the problem wasn't mistaking identity, wasn't lack of information, but the way she had assumed who belonged in that space and who didn't, before any facts were even presented. Charlotte looked up, staring at her reflection in the glass door. A successful woman used to being heard and trusted, and for the first time she wondered what that had shielded her from questioning. She typed on, this time like a monologue she had never dared say aloud. If it had been a white girl, would I have done the same? The question sat there on the screen. No rhetorical question mark. No justification following, just existing as a stark truth. Charlotte read it over many times, each time feeling it heavier, because she knew her answer, even if unwilling to admit it, had been clear from the very first moment. Outside, the city sank deeper into night, the buildings across the street dimming some lights. But in Charlotte's office the light stayed on, shining on a desk full of half-open browser windows. Stories about a man and a child she never thought she would have to face this way. She kept reading, kept taking notes, not to prepare for a meeting or an apology, but to better understand what had happened inside herself. When the clock on the screen ticked past midnight, Charlotte was still there, exhausted but alert, for the first time not trying to fix her image, or control the narrative, but forced to confront the truth, that what she had done wasn't a random mistake, but the result of silent assumptions she had carried too long without ever being challenged. On Monday morning, Charlotte Van Buren left San Francisco on the earliest flight to New York, without bringing any assistance, without notifying the board in advance, only sending Ethan a short message that she would handle this herself, as if by doing so, she could still hold on to some portion of the initiative that had slipped from her grasp since yesterday. Throughout the flight, Charlotte didn't open her laptop, didn't read the news, just stared out the window, her mind strangely blank, not because she had run out of thoughts, but because every thought revolved around the same point. She needed to meet Malcolm Carter, not to persuade him, but to speak, even just once, with the voice of a human being rather than a CEO. When the taxi stopped in front of Carter Meridian Capital's headquarters, Charlotte paused for a moment, in front of the tall glass doors, took a deep breath, adjusted her coat, a familiar gesture whenever stepping into a space of power, but this time it didn't bring the usual sense of confidence. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere was quiet, neat, understated, completely different from the offices Charlotte was accustomed to, where everything tried to proclaim success. She walked to the reception desk, standing straight out of habit, but when she spoke, her voice no longer carried its former certainty. "I'd like to see Mr. Carter," Charlotte said. The receptionist looked up, eyes polite, not scrutinizing, but showing no sign of recognition. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. Charlotte shook her head, not trying to hide it. "No, but please give me 5 minutes." The words came out faster than she intended, carrying an urgency that Charlotte had never allowed to show in previous meetings. The receptionist nodded slightly, typed a few lines on the computer, then paused. "Mr. Carter only meets by appointment," she said, her voice even, not cold but not opening any door. Charlotte stood still for a moment, then nodded, as if she had anticipated that answer. "Then I'll wait," she said, and found a seat near the glass wall herself, where she could see the flow of people outside. Time passed more slowly than usual. Charlotte sat there, hands on her lap, back straight, trying to maintain her familiar composure, but each passing minute made her more aware of her position right now. Staff passing by greeted her politely, asked if she needed water, if she needed any further assistance, but no one asked who she was. No one hurriedly called upstairs to report that she was waiting. Charlotte clearly recognized the difference. She wasn't being treated poorly, but she wasn't being favored either. She was just someone who had arrived without an appointment, and that was enough to place her outside the process. An hour passed, then two. Charlotte checked her watch, checked her phone, then put it away, not wanting to give the impression she was pressing. She remembered yesterday morning, when she had decided in just a few seconds that a child without an appointment didn't belong in her hotel lobby, and that feeling returned, so clear it made her shift in her seat. By noon, the receptionist approached again, saying that Mr. Carter had a full schedule today, and if she wanted, she could leave a message. Charlotte nodded, took the piece of paper, but when the pen touched it, she paused, not knowing what to write beyond what she had already sent in unanswered emails. "I'll keep waiting," she said, her voice no longer trying to maintain professionalism, only raw determination remaining. The receptionist looked at her for a second, then nodded and returned to her post. Charlotte sat there for hours more, witnessing meetings happening around her, other people arriving and leaving, being called by name, invited upstairs while she remained, no one urging her to leave, but no one inviting her either. For the first time in her career, Charlotte Van Buren was in the position of having to ask, not for money, not for a business opportunity, but to be allowed to meet and say something she had missed. As the sky outside began to tilt toward evening, Charlotte was no longer sure if she would meet Malcolm that day, but she didn't stand up to leave. She understood that this waiting wasn't a tactic, wasn't a performance of patience, but the direct consequence of having once believed that some people didn't need to be heard. And in the prolonged silence of Carter Meridian Capital's lobby, Charlotte gradually realized that the seat she was in right now was exactly where she should have been long ago, if she had ever paused to see a child as a person. Near the end of the afternoon, when Charlotte Van Buren had waited long enough for the sense of time to become hazy, the receptionist approached once more, this time with a very slight change in her voice, announcing that Mr. Carter could spare 15 minutes, no more. Charlotte stood up immediately, reflexively adjusting her coat, then stopping, letting her hands drop, leaving the visible fatigue on her face as is, as if she understood that any effort to hide it now would feel out of place. She was led upstairs through a quiet hallway to a small meeting room, not elaborately decorated, where Malcolm Carter was already seated, back straight, hands on the table, eyes calm as if these 15 minutes carried no drama. Charlotte opened her mouth, an apology already about to spill out from the habit of crises she had handled before. But Malcolm raised his hand very lightly, enough to stop her. "Don't start with an apology," he said, voice low and even. Charlotte paused, her breath catching for a beat, then nodded. Malcolm looked straight at her, not probing, not harsh. "The issue isn't that you didn't know I was wealthy," he said, each word falling slowly. "If you had known who I was from the start, the girl wouldn't have had to stand out there. That doesn't make this story any better." Charlotte felt her throat go dry. She started to say something, but Malcolm continued, not letting her escape into familiar explanations. "I'm only asking you one thing," he said. "If the girl wasn't mine, if I weren't sitting here today in this position, would you see what you did as wrong?" The question wasn't thrown like an accusation, but like a final test, and that very fact made it impossible for Charlotte to dodge. She was silent for a few seconds, then took a deep breath. "Yes," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I see it as wrong." Malcolm nodded very slightly, as if merely noting a fact. "You sent my daughter away in 3 minutes," he continued, voice unchanged. "Today you waited 5 hours to see me." Charlotte looked down at the table, the feeling of shame rising clearly, with no room left for self-defense. "I'm ashamed," she said, this time without evasion, without trying to soften it. Malcolm looked at her, his eyes not softening, but not hardening either. "Shame doesn't save anyone," he said. "Action does." He didn't talk about money, didn't mention the deal, didn't refer to any numbers, as if all those things were merely side effects of a far more important issue. Malcolm briefly explained how he had let his daughter go in first, not to set a trap, but to understand the culture of the place he was trusting. He talked about how organizations often show their best face when power is present, and reveal their true nature when they think no one important is standing in front of them. Charlotte listened, without interrupting, without taking notes, just sitting there, for the first time in her professional life, not trying to control the conversation. "I'm not here to punish you," Malcolm said, as if reading her thoughts. "I'm here to see what you'll do when there's nowhere left to hide." Charlotte looked up, her eyes no longer panicked, only weary clarity remaining. "If I say I want to change," she said slowly, "would you believe me?" Malcolm didn't answer right away. He looked out the window for a moment, then back. "I don't need to believe," he said. "I need to see." The clock on the wall ticked softly, reminding them that the 15 minutes were passing quickly. Malcolm stood up, signaling the meeting was nearing its end. "You didn't lose the opportunity because you didn't know who I was," he said, as a conclusion. "You're facing the consequences, because you decided who was worthy of being in your space." Charlotte stood as well, feeling heavy but clearer than ever. As she stepped out of the room, there was no handshake, no promises, just a moral lesson placed directly in her hands, unwrapped, non-negotiable. And in that moment, Charlotte understood that this meeting wasn't a door opening or closing a deal, but the boundary between the person she had believed herself to be, and the person she would have to become if she wanted to move forward. Charlotte had barely stepped out of the meeting room when Malcolm's staff member returned, saying briefly that Mr. Carter wanted to see her one more time, this time not to talk, but to make a decision, and Charlotte nodded immediately, without asking more, as if she understood that everything truly important still hadn't been placed on the table. When she returned to the room, Malcolm was standing by the table, in front of him a thin stack of papers, not thick, no colored tabs, nothing resembling a complex contract, but that very simplicity made Charlotte feel it weighed more than any legal documents she had ever signed. Malcolm didn't sit down, just pushed the stack toward her. "These are the conditions," he said, without emphasis, without lengthy explanation. Charlotte picked it up, reading from the first page, and immediately realized this wasn't an investment agreement in the sense she was familiar with. The first line required a public apology, invasive, not neutral language, naming exactly what had happened, without vague or technical phrases to soften the truth. Charlotte paused for a beat, remembering the press releases her PR team had drafted, the careful wording to minimize liability, and understood that none of that would work anymore. She turned to the next page, which outlined an independent cultural audit not chosen by the company. No right to edit findings, with results disclosed transparently to employees and the public. The following page addressed changes to the board structure, not as a symbolic gesture, but a commitment to substantive diversity, with specific timelines and clear oversight mechanisms. Charlotte felt her heart slow, not from relief, but from understanding the level of intervention this demanded. She read on, to the part about establishing a scholarship fund for underrepresented groups, not bearing the company name, not tied to a PR campaign, and a personal contribution from her own funds, non-deductible, not treated as a business expense. The final section covered long-term leadership coaching, including for Charlotte herself, with periodic reports sent directly to Malcolm's fund, bypassing internal filters. Charlotte looked up, the papers still open in her hand. "You're asking me to change the entire system," she said, her voice steady but unable to hide the weight. Malcolm nodded. "I'm asking you to take responsibility," he said. "My money doesn't buy silence. It only buys change if you truly want it." Charlotte looked down at the papers again, this time not reading line by line, but letting the conditions settle in her mind. She saw the choice in front of her clearly, so clearly no further explanation was needed. One path was to preserve her personal reputation, maintain leadership in the familiar way, accept that the company might not survive this crisis, resulting in hundreds of employees losing their jobs. The other path was to accept having her name tied to a public admission, her personal power curtailed, the career she had built on an image of control and decisiveness, placed under unprecedented scrutiny. Charlotte thought of the people in the company, the engineers who had stayed despite delayed paychecks, the mid-level managers trying to keep team morale, and then she thought of Nia, of how the girl had stood there back straight, not crying, simply excluded from a space without anyone explaining why. "If I sign," Charlotte said, "I won't be the person I used to be." Malcolm looked at her, eyes neither approving nor disapproving. "If you don't sign," he said, "then you'll remain exactly that person." Charlotte was silent for a long time, long enough to feel clearly that this choice couldn't be made out of fear. Finally, she placed the papers on the table, not pushing them back, not holding on to them, just setting them down as a decision taking shape. "I agree," she said. Malcolm didn't nod immediately. "Don't agree because you're afraid of bankruptcy," he said, voice low and clear. "Agree because you understand what you did." Charlotte looked straight at him, not avoiding his gaze. And this time, when she nodded, it was no longer the reflex of a CEO accustomed to saying yes to close a deal, but the acknowledgement of a person who understood that the price wasn't on the balance sheet. Malcolm reached out, not to shake hands, but to take back the signed papers. "Then we begin," he said. Charlotte stepped out of the meeting room for the second time that day, feeling lighter yet more exposed, knowing that what had just happened wasn't an agreement to salvage her image, but a long-term commitment, where every future action of hers would be measured against a standard she had once withheld from a child. The emergency board meeting was convened that very night. Without waiting for morning, without everyone returning to the office, faces appearing one by one on the screen in cold grid squares, the conference room lights reflecting tension. No one bothered to hide anymore. Charlotte Van Buren sat alone at the head of the table, without documents, without an assistant beside her, only placing in front of her the thin file just signed with Carter Meridian Capital, proof that the company had been saved, but also a sign that the full price remained unspoken. The board chairman opened with an even, decisive voice, talking about the spreading media crisis, the flood of calls from partners and shareholders, how the company was now under scrutiny, not for its product or strategy, but for leadership character. Charlotte listened, without interrupting, without defending. When it was her turn, she simply announced briefly that the investment had been committed, the conditions signed, and the company would have sufficient resources to continue operations and pay employees. A few board members nodded slightly in relief, but that relief quickly gave way to heavier air. "The issue isn't whether the company is saved," the chairman said, voice lowering. "The issue is how we got to this point." He looked directly at Charlotte. "You've put us in a position where we can no longer protect you." No one disputed that statement. Another member spoke up, mentioning the investment conditions, the independent cultural audit, the board structure changes in a short time frame, and said that for those commitments to have meaning, the company needed a clear leadership transition. "We can't talk about accountability while keeping everything the same," he concluded. Charlotte nodded slowly. She had understood this from the moment she put pen to paper. It was just now being voiced as an official decision. The board reached consensus faster than she expected. Charlotte would step down as CEO within 30 days, remaining in a transitional role to ensure uninterrupted operations, then fully withdrawing from the executive board. An internal announcement would go out that night, along with the plan to appoint an interim CEO. Charlotte sat still, hands on the table, the sense of loss not hitting like a shock but spreading gradually as each statement was confirmed. She thought of the early years building Van Buren Tech, the sleepless nights, the times convincing the first investors, and realized everything she had built was slipping away irreversibly. The meeting ended without pleasantries or consolation. When the screen went dark, Charlotte remained in the empty conference room, listening to the steady hum of the air conditioning, fully aware that the company had been saved, but its leader had not. The next morning, The official announcement went out to all employees, concise and clear, emphasizing financial stability and the reform roadmap, devoting only a short paragraph to Charlotte stepping down from the EO role after the transition period. She packed her things from the office at the end of the day, no ceremony, no speech, just taking a few personal items, leaving behind the space that had once been the center of her power. As she stepped out of the building after dark, Charlotte paused for a moment, looking up at the glowing company logo, realizing that what she had lost wasn't just the title, but the entire image of the person she had built over many years. And that price was the direct consequence of what had seemed like a very small decision in the hotel lobby that day. 6 months later, Van Buren Tech no longer resembled the company that had been plastered across the news during the crisis days. Not because of scandal, but because of a series of changes that unfolded quietly yet continuously, starting from the day the new CEO officially took over. Ethan Price didn't bring the demeanor of someone coming in to fix the image. He stepped into the leadership role with a cautious tone, few grand statements, but very clear that the company would not return to its old state. The independent cultural audit was implemented exactly as committed. No edits, no filtering of results. And when the report was released internally, many figures made even those who believed they worked in a fair environment pause in shock. The data showed clear disparities in promotion opportunities, in performance evaluations, in how proposals were heard, especially for employee groups previously underrepresented in leadership. Ethan didn't try to soften those findings. He organized open town halls where employee groups were invited to speak without going through direct managers, where stories once seen as individual were placed in their proper systemic context. At first, the atmosphere was reserved, many speaking with the familiar caution, but gradually voices grew more direct, overlooked experiences recounted with the seriousness they had never received before. Some managers left, some positions were restructured, recruitment and evaluation processes were rewritten from scratch, not with slogans but with measurable criteria that could be audited. The company didn't declare itself changed. It simply continued working in the new way, accepting that this shift would cause them to lose a few people, but also open opportunities for those previously unseen. Outside, the media no longer focused on Charlotte Van Buren, but began following the reforms with cautious interest, waiting to see if those commitments would endure or exist only on paper. At the same time, in an Oakland community center, a small scholarship event took place without a big stage, without corporate banners, just simple folding tables and families attending in quiet. Malcolm Carter stood in a corner, talking with the organizers, while Nia stood beside her father, holding a thin folder for the newly established scholarship program, bearing no individual's name, only stating its purpose to support students who had once felt they didn't belong in spaces assumed to be for others. When asked why she wanted to join her father at this scholarship ceremony, Nia thought for a moment, then answered very softly, more to herself than to the person asking, "I don't want anyone to be looked at the way I was that day." There was no applause, no camera flashes, just a few quiet nods from those who understood what the girl meant. Malcolm placed his hand on her shoulder, saying nothing more. 6 months didn't erase the story that had happened, but it placed that story into a longer process, where change didn't come from one individual atoning, but from a system forced to examine itself, and where a small action by a child had opened dialogues that no one had been ready to start before. 1 year later, the Larkspur Grand hotel lobby was lit again for a mid-sized investment event. Not noisy, not flashy like the lavish launches of the past, but enough to draw familiar faces from finance and tech. The space remained the same. The marble floor still meticulously polished. The front desk still in its old spot, only the atmosphere had changed. Slower, more reserved, as if the place had learned to be careful with its own image. Nia Carter walked in through the main entrance, beside her father. No one stopping her, no one questioning, no lingering curious glances. The girl was a little taller than the year before, her walk more confident, the old backpack replaced by a simple canvas bag, and the white envelope from that day no longer present. Malcolm Carter paused to greet a few acquaintances, not introducing his daughter with titles or achievements, just lightly placing his hand on Nia's shoulder, as father and daughter blended into the flow of people in the lobby. In another corner of the space, Charlotte Van Buren stood near a secondary reception table, no longer surrounded by assistants or partners. No prominent name tag, just an attendee in the role of independent advisor for a small fund. She dressed more simply than before, her eyes observing more than seeking attention. And when she saw Nia enter, Charlotte didn't look away, didn't approach immediately, just stood still for a beat, letting the familiar feeling, now no longer sharp, pass through. Malcolm noticed Charlotte first. He gave a slight nod in greeting, a brief gesture but enough to acknowledge each other's presence in this new context. Charlotte walked over, not hurried, not bowing excessively, just stopping at a comfortable distance. "Hello," she said. Malcolm responded with a short handshake, not prolonged, not carrying transactional meaning. "Hello," he said, then looked toward Nia. The girl looked at Charlotte, not probing, not afraid, just calm as with any other adult. No one mentioned the past. No one apologized further. No one explained. Before moving on, Malcolm said one very short sentence, voice low and clear, not directed solely at Charlotte, but as if for the entire space. "No one needs to be a billionaire's child to be treated with kindness." Charlotte nodded, feeling that statement was no longer a personal reminder to her, but a principle placed among those present. As Malcolm and Nia continued into the lobby, blending into the ongoing conversations, Charlotte stood alone for a moment, watching them, no longer feeling the loss as before, but a quiet closure. The hotel lobby continued operating. Guests came and went, conversations carried on, but something had changed without anyone needing to announce it. And somewhere in that familiar space, the story didn't end with an apology or a symbolic handshake, but with a much simpler realization. Change doesn't begin with an apology. It begins with seeing a child as a person. If this story touched you, please subscribe to continue joining stories about dignity, responsibility, and real change. See you in the next episode, where a small moment can continue to shake an entire system.